Has the 25th India-ASEAN Summit given the practice of diplomacy a new vision? To answer that, we have S.R. Tayal, former Ambassador of India. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. And Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Professor and Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Thank you, Professor Chaulia. So, Dr. Chaulia, to give the practice of diplomacy new vision, there's got to be greater focus. Ideas have to be much clearer. The delivery of the whole process has got to be more firm, clear. Do you find that happening? And that's why, with the clarity of vision, perhaps the diplomacy is being given a new practice.
Absolutely, Mark. I think last 3 years under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we have transformed our image in front of the international community. And ASEAN, as you know, we used to call it a Look East policy.
That's
earlier.
Right.
It's been rechristened as Act East. And I think we are really acting and putting our money where the mouth is. A lot of these connectivity corridors that had been delayed or got tangled up in bureaucratic hurdles have been fast forwarded now.
Okay.
So I think ASEAN also realizes that we are at a critical time, at a critical juncture where the Chinese shadow is lengthening over them, and their dependence on China, especially in trade, is tremendous. So they're looking for new partners for diversification away from it. And I think the fact that they accepted unanimously to come as a collective, as a group, for our Republic Day, which is, interestingly, Republic Day is a show of India's military might, of its rise as a emerging power. So for any head of state or government to be present, it means that they endorse India's rise and they don't see India as a threat or as a challenge, but as an opportunity. So I think what we are seeing now with the ASEAN, the commemorative summit, and their presence as a group is that ASEAN as a whole is saying we need more of India in our surroundings, which is Southeast Asia and beyond, Northeast Asia. We need more of India in a military sense, more of India in an economic sense, more of India, as Prime Minister is saying, in the cultural and the religious sense for promoting their ties, more of India in terms of even our diaspora. People often forget that we have nearly 4 million people of Indian origin settled in these countries. This is the second largest cluster after what we have in the Gulf. So if you take all these factors, I think it's a critical moment, and the practice of diplomacy, which you have put it, I think we are now taking it to the next level through this what I call cluster diplomacy. We are showing that India has convening power. What Prime Minister Modi is saying is we call and the whole world comes to our doorstep and they welcome our rise. We are not seen as a threat.
So connectivity has been an issue, Dr. Chaulia. And of course, these big projects require a lot of negotiation as well. I mean, it's one thing to say complete the trilateral highway, but there has been a motor vehicles agreement also that's tough to negotiate. We can't have vehicles that can't drive into those countries. So apart from that, there has also been other kind of technical issues in terms of the Kaladan multimodal project as well with Myanmar. So when we look at connectivity, perhaps the focus could be on air connectivity as well.
We have established fairly good air connections
for tourism, especially.
Thailand has attracted a lot of our tourists, so has Singapore. But the undiscovered parts, I would emphasize, within ASEAN are what we call the CLMV countries: Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar and Vietnam. These are relatively less trodden for our people, but historically and culturally they are important. These are part of what we call Indo-China, where our Buddhism and Hinduism had a vast influence. And even today, if you go to Cambodia, for example, or Indonesia, or even the Philippines, you will find that there are lots of names which are Sanskrit sounding, and their vocabulary is full of Indian names, and parts of eastern India, by the way, have always historically been connected. In Odisha, for example, they have something called Bali Jatra, where they celebrate our connection with Bali, which is today in Indonesia. And people often forget that actually ASEAN is as much our neighbor as SAARC is. And I want to emphasize this point, Mark, because from Andaman and Nicobar Islands, it is just 90 nautical miles to the tip of Indonesia, 22 nautical miles to Myanmar. So these are our neighbors. These are maritime neighbors. We have a land border with Myanmar. And I think we need to change. I think what Prime Minister Modi, through this shock and awe kind of diplomacy where there are 10 presidents, prime ministers at the same time, is in a way, sending the message across our own society to reorient ourselves. We've been too land-oriented and too Western in our focus as to who our neighbors are. We always talk about China, Pakistan, but frankly, the opportunity with less friction, less abrasiveness, and more welcoming mat is actually with Southeast Asia, and we should pursue this far more, and I think that's the bigger message.
Dr. Chaulia, the maritime domain is not only, maritime security, it's also the blue economy and, the various industries that could be associated with sustainable development of the oceans, renewable energy, the fisheries, etc. How do you look at this and the cooperation, because both India and the ASEAN have a lot of water?
Yeah, in fact, we are part of the Mekong Ganga initiative, which is meant to connect the synergies of the riverine and oceanic commerce. And Prime Minister's blue economy concept also will enhance greater trade as well as movement of people and services across these neighbors. But one thing I want to mention, Mark, is that a country like Vietnam, for example, is still standing up and challenging China on the South China Sea disputes.
Okay.
And they are even inviting American aircraft carriers.
Sure.
Given the history of Vietnam and the United States, you know what that means, that the first time they're coming back. So they are looking for a greater naval cooperation also. And given that now we have revived the Quad idea with Japan and with Australia and the United States, I think we will be a bigger player, and ASEAN also looks forward to the Quad becoming operationalized one way or the other. Although they are wary about angering China too much because they are dependent on China. So it's a balancing act.
Run short of time. Our expectations from the ASEAN countries, what do they really expect from India? The Prime Minister says India is committed to maintaining maritime security in the region. India's commitment is there, but it's a difficult task when we look at it.
Yeah, our capacities are growing, Mark. If you look at our stated purpose of becoming a net security provider across the Indian Ocean region. See, one way of looking at Southeast Asia and ASEAN is they are also the eastern end of the Indian Ocean and where the Western Pacific begins. So from Africa to Southeast Asia, if India is supposed to be the net security provider, our Navy, our Coast Guard, there's a lot of bilaterals Prime Minister had with a number of countries where we promised more assistance with coastal guards, in which we have some expertise. Then there are other issues about non-traditional threats. For example, the ISIS threat has increased in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and there again, we need to be concerned about possible movement of jihadist extremists into our own country and across the Indian Ocean region. So, and then there is a conventional threat, which we don't usually publicly say it, but the fact is the elephant in the room or the dragon in the room is China, as Ambassador Mukherjee was mentioning. And so in all these fronts, be it freedom of the sea lanes, be it ridding the region, the Malacca Straits are there through which a lot of commerce flows, and we should be very keen not to prevent the resurgence of piracy, which has been a problem. So in all these domains, I think India can be a provider. That's one. The other is these poorer countries of ASEAN, especially Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, they are looking for Indian outward investments. So on one hand, we are getting investments from Singapore, and we are also looking from richer countries like Malaysia. But these smaller ones like Cambodia, Laos, they really want Indian companies to actually set up shop there and manufacture there, because they have lots of concessions to export to Europe and to North America as least developed countries. So I think we need to do both ways. The investment has to flow. Right now, Vietnam is where we've invested 1.1 billion nearly, but not so much in Cambodia, Laos. And these are actually in the Chinese basket, so to say. The Chinese have tried to exploit their influence in these countries and blackmail these countries into dividing ASEAN and all that. So I think Prime Minister Modi is making a big statement here. He is saying we value the whole of ASEAN, not this cluster or that cluster. And I think that's a good approach, because earlier we were seen to be only working on one or two key countries and not looking at the entire region. Now 10 of them are here, and I think we need to redress the imbalances in our attention as well to some of these weaker countries, and that way we'll be a bigger force in this entire region.
Dr. Chaulia, speaking of tourism, one of the areas that we hope will develop with our Act East policy and with ASEAN is our Northeast region. Now, in that context, do you find connectivity could be better established between the Northeast and the rest of ASEAN through flights. Because, I mean, the land route is there to Myanmar, which is the neighbor, but, there are impediments there as well. But, over the flights, do you think they could be increased, or do you think there would be demand? How do you look at it?
A lot of it will depend on the trade and the investment flows, because once there's a business community involved which is regularly traveling, that's why it's very important that we key in on the CLMV countries. And then multimodal transport is actually, by water, sea and air and land, all three will be required, because some of these countries are archipelagos, like big ones like Indonesia is the very centerpiece of ASEAN, and for us to be able to reach it, there's no land route. So on the other hand, up to Vietnam, we can extend the trilateral corridor even beyond Thailand, go up to Vietnam. So we'll have to really look at the map and see, which are the different points of connectivity and how to leverage them. The Chinese, by the way, we must learn from them, because they are far superior on this aspect, So while on one hand ASEAN wants to balance China and to bring in India more for their own autonomy, the fact is that the Chinese are ahead of us in this game, and we should be taking a leaf out of them. And in a way, we should be speeding up our existing connectivity corridors, and also proposing new means involving air as well, because that's how...
lots of flights to China, but not too many to India.
Exactly.
Dr. Chaulia, as far as trade is concerned, it's $70 billion, but huge potential, isn't it?
Yeah,
what we can look at, what is China? It's at 350,
5 times more.
Yeah, so there you are.
Yeah, and I think the reason is, as our Make in India leaps forward in the coming years, you should expect far more volumes. Because right now, we don't have enough manufactured products, because these are some of the richer ASEAN countries are highly industrialized already. So for them, they actually are looking at things like pharma, and we should be emphasizing services, for example, telecom, banking. Prime Minister spoke about how India could offer solutions for digitizing villages in Southeast Asia.
Yes.
We have done that in Africa, which is of course much poorer, but some of these countries do need digitization, and I think India has got the low-cost technology for it. So these are some of the ways by which we can enhance our presence in these regions, and also show that we are providing public goods, because these countries are actually no nonsense. I mean, in the sense their diplomacy is all on the basis of give and take, and that's why China is so important for them. And United States is stepping back. You see, under Trump, there's so much uncertainty. These countries cannot rely on the US. So in a way, if you look at the strategic space right now, there is an opening for India, but we must latch onto it quickly. And this is the Republic Day parade, and their presence here is, I think, the start of what could be the new era, or the second phase of after 25 years. We should look at the next 25 years and leapfrog in our relationship.
Dr. Chaulia, how does one, because the intention is there, obviously the government is keen, and the ASEAN leaders are also keen to get this relationship to the next level in terms of, fulfilling its potential, the drivers, the individuals involved, the diplomats involved. How do we take it forward?
Well, definitely the Modi government has put a front foot forward with ASEAN, and that's commendable. But I think we must also draw in the other interested stakeholders, because Southeast Asia, ASEAN is part of Indo-Pacific. It's part of the broader Act East policy, which also includes Northeast Asia. Japan is becoming very central. Japan and India, if we implement the Asia-Africa growth corridor, Southeast Asia will be a way station. So if they are open to China's One Belt, One Road, they will also be very much open to Japan and India partnering along with Australia, United States, to create this Asia-Africa growth corridor. So I think there are different ways by which we can bring in more players, because in checkbook diplomacy, we cannot match the Chinese. But at the end of the day, there are some strengths of India, which is, it is seen as less threatening and as a benign power. And I think we must capitalize on this, bring in a few more stakeholders, and then we'll see, jointly, if you have a strategy for Southeast Asia, I think it's going to bring dividends.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on this special discussion.